Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and I'm here with Stefan Bertram Lee, PhD student. Uh, I guess in the United States we'd say you're a candidate because you're past your coursework, but in Britain it doesn't matter so much. So, PhD student, and you just completed your first draft of your dissertation?
Well, I did it a couple of months ago, but yeah.
Yeah. So, have you defended it yet?
No, that'll be in the winter.
Okay.
I'll submit the finished thing at the end of summer.
Fun. And it's on this topic, which is the history of privilege and its limitations as a concept. And so we're just going to go straight into it. Stefan, what the fuck is privilege and where does it come from?
So my kind of elevator pitch was, to go back to the French Revolution, the bourgeois revolutions of that time, where there was a lot of discourse around privilege at that time. But the French announcement of the abolition of feudalism, they were like, we've done privilege, we defeated it, it's gone, it doesn't exist anymore. And by that they meant the abolition of these kind of peculiar rights which existed in pre-bourgeois societies, where in France they had rules where aristocrats could own certain kinds of birds and stuff like this. And very consequential restrictions, like peasants weren't allowed to mill their own grain. They had to mill it at the mill of a landowner, which is obviously very useful for them. But it wasn't just aristocrats that had these kind of unfair, privileged laws behind them. Cities, guilds, and so on all had, like, the feudal network of laws is not kind of laws as we understand them now, where basically they're these kind of universal things. Which apply equally to everyone and everything, and this is an innovation of the French Revolution and other developments in bourgeois development. So
yeah, go ahead.
This kind of revolution happened. They took that privilege was defeated. The kind of what happened in France spread out either violently. It happened in some places, or it happened like it did in Britain, where there was this slow bourgeois capture of the country, and that came along with these ideas of universal laws, the end of privilege, as it was understood by the French revolutionaries. And kind of exactly at the time where these peculiar laws were totally defeated, then this new idea of privilege appears. This new idea of privilege, which is based on the social inequalities between persons, not based on formal inequalities, and often not referencing anything to do with economics, but kind of the small humiliations of public life. Like a famous one from the original Macintosh is, black people getting followed around stores while white people don't. These kind of social humiliations. But interestingly and notably from the beginning, privilege talk was not just interested in talking about these sorts of things, these kind of social inequalities of the social sphere, these informal social qualities, but talking about them from the perspective, allegedly, of the group on top, the beneficiary group, the alleged beneficiary group, who don't go through these things. So it wasn't just a focus on these kind of informal inequalities, but an attempt to kind of invert what has been going on for at least a century in discourse inequality, where you focus on the discrimination, on the discriminated, on the downtrodden, and so on.
So we have a shift from formal to informal and from legal to social uses of the term privilege. And this happens shortly after the French Revolution. Where does this initially come from? France, England, the US, like where's it bubbling up from first as a primary discourse pattern?
Well, the revival comes in the late 1980s, just as the Soviet Union is coming to bits, from this academic Peggy Macintosh.
Yeah.
And it's really quite amazing. I really had an easy job in my PhD, because normally you do this kind of discursive research and you see all these kinds of sources. Each author of the 21st century is drawing from a different author of the 20th century. But that's not what I found in my sample at all. What I found in my popular sample, in my academic sample, was everyone just references Macintosh.
Yeah, that
There is
invisible
this.
knapsack piece, right? That's pretty much where it all initially comes from. And Macintosh is an academic, but she's kind of an interesting academic for this to come up from, because she's a pedagogist. She teaches teachers. So
Yeah, and a lot of the drama subsequently has focused on the fact that it has this presence in teaching. Like the biggest drama we've had about privilege in the UK came from a parliamentary select committee, which I don't know if there's an equivalent thing in the US, where MPs from both parties get together to kind of make a report on how some social issue is going wrong. And the one where white privilege came up, white privilege, and yeah, notably, we should say that in this discourse, while it's portrayed in such a way as it applies to everything, any equality between anyone, between any groups, to any degree counts as privilege. But despite that, interestingly, 90% or 95% of the focus is on white privilege, on racial inequality, which is obviously, not entirely expected considering the current mood of the United States. But the drama in the UK happened in Parliament over the issue of working class white children. Working class white children in schools in the UK have the worst educational outcome of anyone apart from traveling people, which I guess is not really an idea you have in the US and other places that aren't Europe, but as in Roma and Irish traveler, like nomadic peoples, who obviously have terrible, terrible educational outcomes because they often don't go to school. And when they do go to school, they're only there for one term or something before their family moves on in their nomadic lifestyle. But these terrible educational outcomes of white working class children, the Tories then tried to complain about the fact that in at least some schools, people are talking about white privilege. And then the Labour people were like, well, you're the guys that brought this up. Then obviously the problem here isn't people talking in school talking about white privilege. The problem is, a decade and a half of underfunding and so on. And then the head teachers union was like, both of you idiots arguing over white privilege have managed to totally dismantle, because it was very rarely in this case, they managed to put out a report where the Labour MPs refused to sign on to it, which never happens in parliamentary select committees. You meant to form a consensus report. And so the head teachers union was fuming because they had this report which was meant to be about kind of helping white working class children. But because of the circumstances it was formed under, because the Tories tried to insert this clause about white privilege, complaining about white privilege, the report basically didn't go forward.
So the Macintosh piece very much comes out in the 80s. The only thing I can find about white privilege before that is white skin privilege in Marxist-Leninist circles around W.E.B. Du Bois and people such as him. So how do we get to, what is the nascent prehistory here? Where did Macintosh get this discourse pattern and idea from?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. At least Macintosh kind of narrates it as this purely kind of like self-discovery thing, where she was just thinking about the fact that men at her university allegedly are benefiting from the disadvantage of women, but then had the thought that, well, actually, presumably the case is the same about me in regards to my black colleagues. But actually, at least probably, she did get some inspiration from these new left texts, especially, what's it called? White skin privilege? Oh, white blind spot. White blind spot, white skin privilege. Which is this new left text, which is interesting both in how it's different from the later privilege text and in the ways that it's similar. It's different in that it's a Marxist-Leninist text. It actually has a clear reasoning. It's in privilege discourse, it's really often unclear, like why privilege exists, who's enforcing privilege, if there is such a thing, like why does it exist, what are the mechanisms that uphold it, beyond like the most kind of just most vague possible sentiments. But regardless of how plausible what they're saying is, in white blind spot, they're very clear on kind of what's causing it, that it's basically kind of like a conspiracy by the elite, and it does go off this W.E. Bois idea of kind of this white spiritual wage, as well as like an actual wage advantage, which basically allows the ruling class to divide the working class by capturing the white portion of the working class with relative advantage based off discrimination of the black population, which is this quite kind of standard argument. Oh, shut up, Happy. The thing is, I can't even kick the dog out because the back door has a cat flap, and she's small enough to just go through that. So it's just, you have to live with it. Hallie's 17, but goes running with me. Very amazing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well.
So this white skin text, white blind spot, basically, yeah, it says, our efforts as the new left so far have failed because we haven't talked about race enough, which is quite a funny idea, but maybe it made sense at the time. And it basically positions itself as a way forward for the Marxist-Leninist working class struggle in the United States. But there are kind of the prefiguring features of what we see in later privileged discourse, where the focus is on, they say, like, you shouldn't go to white workers and be like, we're going to take away your shit. But as regard, like, the vanguardists, they do start, even here we can see like the psychological features that are so present in privileged discourse, where they're like, you need to engage in like this 24-hour vigilance against your white privilege. You need to constantly be aware of it, like psychologicalize it. There's a real focus on awareness and constant self-vigilance and kind of a specific kind of cultivation of the self.
So we have this this turn towards self-focus. In the case of W.E.B. Du Bois and in the southern context of the United States, what he's saying does make some sense, but why does this get appropriated by the New Left so much? I mean, is it just because the New Left in the United States was in the United States? Is it because, and thus universalizing what was something very particular to the U.S., or is it something larger than that?
Yeah, I guess the kind of, again, the positive thing about White Blind Spot compared to later texts is that it's probably not universalizing these features. It seems to be saying, like, these are peculiarities of the situation of the class struggle in the United States, as opposed to later works of privilege, which see privilege as existing in every moment in space and time that's ever existed. Never will exist, because there's often in privilege discourse no clear way where it could possibly end. But yeah,
go ahead.
In these, sorry, what was the question?
No, I was asking, like, so this initially comes up in a U.S. context. Does it spread to the New Left in Europe, or does it remain in just the American New Left?
I think this kind of discourse didn't even become prominent within the New Left. I think kind of these guys were writing at like the very tail end of it. Obviously, there was an increased focus on kind of racial issues in the New Left as it kind of degenerated. But I don't think this discourse happened around white privilege. I think basically this term was founded then, but largely fell out of the discourse until it was revived by Macintosh. But then even then, I don't think really it was until the early 2000s that people started really reading Macintosh. And then comes along her later works where she attempts to kind of clarify what's going on here after these 1989 works, these two 1989 and 1988 works suddenly become enormously popular.
Yeah, when I was in teachers college in the mid-aughts, around 2005, we went through the Macintosh checklist, and it was still not yet even that late as codified as it would be like just 5-10 years later. It really seems to have caught a life about a decade after. But one of the things that I remember just going through the checklist is some of the assertions are not true. Any white person can live in it. Like, there is very much an assumption of economic neutrality amongst racial groups.
I mean, there's a bizarre one where she says, like, oh, an example of my white privilege is that I can get like an academic piece published on white privilege, which is like, that's not because you're white. That's because you're a professor.
Right. So So we have Macintosh. Why do you think Macintosh comes to such prominence? I mean, it felt like for me, when I really started seeing it, I mean, she was taught in pedagogic schools. Like I said, I learned it in teachers college, but I didn't see it in public discourse until just before the election of Barack Obama. But it may have been simmering, somewhere. So what did your research find?
I think a notable thing about Macintosh and why, so for instance, what happens often in discourse is that you'll have something in academia, then it'll be translated by someone into kind of like a middle discourse. And then that kind of middle discourse, middle text will be taken up by popularizers. Mm-hmm. And often there'll be various middle texts, which take this original text, translate it into more understandable language, and then it enters the popular world in a more disparate form. But I think what's notable about Macintosh's text, as I'm sure you know from your experience, is that they're super, super short, super, super simple, and super, super clear. I think it's obviously, not a project you should do if it doesn't work. But if you're kind of like a movement, you want to get an idea across, you're trying to summarize like dialectical materialism or anything like this, if you can get it on 2 sides of A4 in simple language that anyone can understand, you 100% should, because I think an enormous part of the success of Macintosh's work just comes directly from that fact of the works are incredibly theoretically light and they can be taken up by anyone. And this leads to a discourse which is surprisingly like not riven with contradictions. I think lots of popular discourses are a complete mess for understandable reasons, because people have this idea that, racism is bad or whatever, but they haven't read W. Du Bois, for instance, and they have a vague understanding that kind of like, there's racism and discrimination against some people and maybe like it benefits other people, but there's no way that they have like a clear theoretical background. And certainly if anyone does, then it's not shared by nearly everyone else. And even the people that do have a clear theoretical background have a different one to someone else's. But Macintosh's text is really incredible in this way. It's so short, it's so clear, it's so direct that instead of, having to go through translators, discursive translators, her work is directly taken up by the popular kind of like woke books that became enormously popular after the killing of George Floyd.
It's interesting because I think this is one of the few times where it benefits that it came out of a teacher's school, because if you've ever read teachers' intellectual preparatory material, and I don't mean to insult my colleagues, but it's written like it's for like, they write to teachers as if they are the students that the teachers are teaching, and that's going to be my nice way of saying it. I recently got some digital liturgy textbooks, and I was like, man, this is like at a 6th grade Lexile level or something. This is ridiculous. But that you're right. Like, if we take racism, and still now, even between critical race theorists, there's not one operant definition of racism. There's so many out there. I mean, my favorite thing recently is discovering how Alexander Dubin uses racism, which is to out like Robin DiAngelo. But there is those are contested definitions, like popular ones when I was in college, which would have been in the late 90s, early aughts, were like racism is power plus privilege. All right, which
what is power? Like, that's something I think power is probably much more difficult to translate than any of the other words involved there,
Right. Privilege people know, but then like people like, okay, but so the reason why it was worded that way is so that black people or people of color could not be racist. That was the whole.
Like you're just always trying to construct a definition which that is true.
Right. A definition where it's only unidirectional. And then you had there was a backlash to that, even within critical race theory, where they're like, okay, well, that's not really coherent. We can't figure out what power means. So then you had the split between the 3 kinds of racism: implicit bias racism, systemic racism, and bigotry. But then there was a move in critical race theory reincorporating this privilege discourse, actually. that just said, well, no, those are all the same thing. And what's at stake here is privilege. I mean, Abraham X. Kendi just says there's not systemic racism, and there's just racism. I'm like, well, that and no time in my life have things made better for going more specific to vague. So,
I mean, Kendi then goes that black people are racist, or at least black people can be racist.
Correct.
So he goes the other way, where he's just like, yeah, actually, we're all just racist. Which then Finkelstein is like makes the important point, and it's very clear that this is also a massive thing with privilege, is that when you just apply a word to everything, this doesn't give you this incredibly powerful discourse, which allows you to just defeat everything, but just totally debases the word. It totally debases the word, and it's like, it means what's going on with anti-Semitism presently. If you insist that everything is anti-Semitism, and you insist that these various things that people think are good are anti-Semitic, some people are going to stop doing that thing or be, question it. But some people are going to go, okay, I guess I'm anti-Semitic then.
Yeah, well, yeah, structural anti-Semitism and then the expansion of anti-Semitism would be anti-Zionism, criticism of banking at all. That's I've been told that's structurally anti-Semitic.
Just bringing up that someone's rich.
Yeah.
Doing tropes.
You hear this in liberal discourse whenever there's this conspiracy about a rich person. They're like, it's a stand-in for Jews. And I was like, sometimes it is, but a lot of times it isn't. Like
why you, the proud, lovely liberal of the D'Angelo class, why are you thinking about Jews whenever anyone brings up money?
So, one of the things I think that your research gets to is that if we go back to the initial impulse of critique of formal privilege in the French Revolution, the goal is to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not sure that's the goal. And if it is the goal, there's two ways to do that. And one of them is to just make everyone have a shittier life instead of improving anyone's lot. That is one implication. But I wanted to, what are the rhetorical usage? What are the, so we have this very clear concept. And I agree with you. One of the things about privilege discourse is it's clear, it's relatively easy to understand. It's when people object to it, unlike other things, it's not because they don't understand what you're saying or they have a different definition. It's because they're like, usually like, well,
yeah, most people understand the concept and hate it.
Right.
Like, it's really unpopular when you do empirical testing on it, which has just happened. I couldn't really include it in the main bit of my PhD, but I just talk about it in the introduction. When you give the word to people, it just makes the discourse worse. It just makes things worse. It makes people upset. It makes people refuse to engage. And that's not because they misunderstand it, but it's because they really do understand it. But yeah, I think you highlighted kind of the two main kind of discursive things going on with privilege. One is, in terms of like a solution, one is, downgrading, which is we can solve problems like white people having too much dignity by making sure the police are indignant to them. And the other side is to conclude that getting rid of privilege is impossible. And the only thing we can do is maintain a lifelong vigilance against ourselves, against how we've been raised, against how we've been made, to do this for our whole lives, to constantly guard against ourselves, to engage in this weird self-help thing where we're constantly engaged in this struggle of self-improvement, but the end goal can never be reached. And it's very interesting. There's this constant refrain in privilege discourse to the idea of the systemic or the systematic, but it's never, well, actually, I mean, I did eventually kind of work out what the origin of it in Macintosh is from her later works. But they always talk about the systemic, the systematic, but then all their solutions, all their kind of concerns are raise awareness about privilege and kind of just engage with privilege like inside your own mind, which goes into this neoliberal moment we're in, where we've gone from we're at a point where like it's now completely acceptable for the government to be like, you need wellness training if you're going to be a functioning proletariat or whatever. The previously like walled off and hidden away internal mind is now just an open target that the state, NGOs, and whatever, racial educators are seemingly, it's this amazing thing where it's apparently impossible to change like the actual physical world, but it's really easy, allegedly, to change people's internal cognition, which is a complete reversal of seemingly the truth of things, but also how discourse has operated until now, where changing the insides of people's heads, like if we talk about like the 1960s and whatever, they were saying, okay, like people are really racist, but through Congress and stuff, we can achieve at least relative reductions in inequality. And then when we're not so poor, people will hate us less. We've gone completely the reverse, where the focus is on, intervening in our minds instead of intervening in the physical world.
Well, it's interesting to me because I think it kind of gets to something that Adolf Reed and Norman Finkelstein have both brought up, but something that I've really thought about too. When you focus in on racial privilege, one thing you can do is erase class amongst minority groups and also simultaneously project poverty as only a minority problem. So it serves two functions. It gives you a reason not to help. It turns white people against anything that would actually disproportionately quite often help white people. And conversely, on the other end of the same spectrum, it hides the fact that often when we're talking to, like, say, Black or Indigenous academics, we're literally talking to people richer than their white counterparts in the general culture, which is both a proof of some kind of systemic racism, but also a way to flatten that out so that these people can receive benefits as if you were helping poor Black people in Detroit. And what confused me about the aught teens is somehow this makes it to Europe, and I am just baffled by why Europeans would pick up this discourse at all. So, but let's yeah, go ahead.
Have you seen the recent drama in the UK with David Tennant?
Yeah, I've seen some of it. Yeah,
well, the great thing is that the Black woman he was criticizing, who then instantly turned to IDPOL to defend herself, to be like, a man can't tell a woman to shut up. She's meant to be like the grand, crusading, heroic, anti-identity politics figure of our right wing.
Oh, I mean, honestly, the Tories have kept up the tradition of George W. Bush and making sure that they have enough people of color in their leadership that it's harder to critique them for that. But
it makes the whole discourse in the UK, like, we had a brief moment where every single leader in the United Kingdom and Ireland were all POCs, while at the same moment, there's still apparently like the main problem in Britain, according to woke people, is us being racist.
So Macintosh has a distinction in her privilege categories. Can we talk a little bit about that here?
Well, she tries to make one. In her early work, it's really fascinating, to be honest. In 1988 and 1989 work, in both pieces, at some point she says, actually, maybe privilege isn't such a good idea, which is insane. It's as if she's reacting to this previous discourse, but the only previous discourse is her own work. Like, it's this bizarre thing where as soon as she introduces privilege, like 500 words later, she's like, okay, maybe hold on, maybe there's a problem here. Like, but she does try to address this initial problem in her early works by saying, let's try and make a categorization of things that we would wish to universalize and things we would wish to abolish. So, you can talk about a privilege that male academics might have, where they're basically free to were free to engage in like low-level sexual harassment of female staff. That's a kind of privilege we'd want to abolish. And then there's kind of the ability for male academics to do their own research without people constantly questioning, well, why are you doing that? Why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing this instead? And that's kind of a privilege we wish to universalize. And so she introduces these categories, introduces the possibility, introduces like some language that we could use to describe it. And then this bit, maybe because it's on page 2 of these very short texts and that's not read by anyone, disappears. And disappears not only in the works which are of Macintosh's inheritors, of the people of Quota that cite her, but it also disappears in her own work. She makes a series of texts in the late 2000s and the teens discussing, she's trying to update privileged discourse. She's trying to cope with the fact that her early works became enormously popular, but as happens with every single author that has an early popular work, even one as simple as hers, it's not taken up in exactly the way that she would want. Ali, shut up. Not taken up in the way that she would like. But what happens in these texts is she tries to clarify like these kind of minor things. Like she has a metaphor of like a bank account, which is being roundly criticized by other theorists for basically disappearing the actual process of racial accumulation. And if you kind of take it seriously, there doesn't seem to be any way it could operate without blaming Black people for basically oppressing themselves. Because in privileged discourse, and it's a very important part of privileged discourse, normal white subjects, until they're made aware of privilege, are alleged to be completely ignorant that racism exists, that privilege exists, that advantage exists. But she just doesn't, this more complicated language, which would, I think, make privilege into a discourse which could at least possibly have a positive effect. Like obviously, it's very plausible it wouldn't. But this idea that, you know, we have some privileges which should be universalized and some which should be abolished would make the discourse so much better, but it simply doesn't exist in these later works, even of Macintosh.
Do you have a theory as to why it disappears?
I think, to go back to this theoretically light thing, it's too complicated. There's like 3 things there, Varn. Like, if you just stick to the first page of these texts, there's just this one thing, privilege. That's very, very simple. It's easy. But also because once you start talking about, I think, universalizing and abolishing and so on, then you have to actually get into policy questions. You have to actually, like, how would we go about doing this sort of thing? And to people who want to write basically like racial self-help, this universalizing and this abolishing stuff, that's no good, because subjects, particular subjects, can't universalize or abolish anything. The only thing they can do is work on themselves. And so making this distinction isn't useful to them. It's not useful in this discourse. It's not useful to the writer nor the alleged subject, because they can't actually universalize or abolish anything. So I think it gets dropped because, you know, it's this very slight complication on this very simple discourse, but also because it doesn't serve the sort of racial kind of discourse which wants, like, one thing I found in my popular sample, I got these top 10 books that were hit the New York Times bestsellers in 2020 after George Floyd was killed. And I found half of them, it was 5-4, half of them didn't use privilege. Basically, they would use it just a couple times per text, up to, you know, a couple dozen in 100,000 words. And then there's another set which used privilege a lot. Like almost every page, privilege would be talked about. One had a whole chapter on privilege, one used privilege, and each used privilege for something that was very important. Like, for instance, in D'Angelo's text, she defines racism through privilege. She talks about in terms of, she defines privilege as basically like the process by which there is privilege or something like this. In another, privilege is the way that she tries to get around the thorny issue of like who is white and white passing, this idea where she just defines it as, you know, white people with white privilege. that's the subject she's addressing. How are you meant to find that out? I guess it's, again, it's up to your phenomenological engagement with the world, your personal sort of judgment yourself about whether you have white privilege or not.
Yeah, so this is the thing. It's not just that white passing, it's also recognition of white passingness, which makes it very, very subjective. So instead of, because white passing traditionally, even in like white skin privilege discourse, that wasn't decided by you. Like your racial identity was not relevant to that. So there was none of this idea of like for example, if you're Latin, whether or not you pick to be like Chicano or white Latin or whatever, and in the United States, that's presented often as almost a personal choice. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But there was,
you put it on the census, and then you get your racial card in the mail.
Well, I mean, it was a way to get around the racial. It's interesting about U.S. things here, because the reason why it's voluntary in the United States is because there used to be legal codes around this, and the grounds for those legal codes were made unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So, like, for example, in the legal codes of the Southeast, I didn't count as white until those were abolished. Now, I was not alive during that time, so it's irrelevant to me. But it was the whole run drop rule thing. Like, and that wasn't even socially constructed. That was legally constructed. So it's
right. And often, like, it was quite a struggle to enforce, because it's quite hard to tell, right?
Right.
Like, it's quite hard to tell that in this one drop rule that you wouldn't be white. It's this interesting thing. There's several members of the English football team who would be black in the United States, would clearly be black in the United States, but in the United Kingdom are considered white. A very clear example is Andrew Tate, who's basically only white because he's British, even though he has an American black father. And if you had an American black father and you grew up in the United States, he'd be black. But he grew up in the UK, so he's white.
Yeah, Tate's an interesting example of the. And what I also find interesting is that isn't debated in the U.S. either. So, like, whatever the perceived social code is from whatever country that you're from is actually how the world perceives you. Because, to be quite frank, and to make people uncomfortable, Andrew Tate has the same claim to being a black man as Barack Obama does. Like legally. So, I mean, like, or socially. Yes, Tate has slightly more white passing features, but it's very clear. I was recently reading a book by Sam Delaney, who's a black man, and I flipped on the back and he looks just like my white stepfather. So it's just like it's like this stuff is very, 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 it gets very tricky and vague, and we know that.
And it's just who's the one guy that isn't allowed to be black in the United States who actually gets his blackness questioned? You would call him Talcum X. I forget his name.
Oh, the person that I look like, Sean King.
Sean King, like, he's the only person in the United States who isn't just allowed to be black. He's the one where people actually question it and say, no, you're not.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, we can get into privilege discourse in academia, because it does seem like academia is the only place where I significantly see people faking their racial categories, where it's happened a bunch. And we know about Dolan's all, I've seen like 20 in the last 10 years.
There's very direct incentives in academia, which are like deliberately structured, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which even like in other places where black people are prominent, it's not a factor of, like, black people aren't prominent in sports because of like discrimination in their favor.
No, if anything, usually in American sports, the people who do it are from whatever the poorest ethnic group is. I mean, like, that's why it was associated with like the Irish and like Germans in the 19th century. So
yeah, especially because the bizarre thing, actually, I mean, that doesn't work. I was going to say with the college system and players not getting paid, but that doesn't make any sense. So ignore me.
Also, players do sometimes get paid now.
Yeah.
It. But so Macintosh seems to want to. You have that first, the universalizable, non-universalizable. There's also like an attempt to work out other kinds of privilege. Although you're right, it almost always gets linked to race.
Oh yeah, because she starts the kind of narration is, I wanted to talk about male privilege, which was male privilege was in like a prominent discussion in the mid 2000s. Sorry, the mid teens. And I assumed going into my research, that's kind of where I first got interested in privilege, through this idea of male privilege. And I assumed going into my research that, you know, there would be a lot on white privilege, but there would be a lot on male privilege too. And she talks about, and, you know, probably there's also this thing called heterosexual privilege or whatever, though I don't really know about it. But then actually in my research and in Macintosh, the focus is almost totally, entirely, especially in the past few years, on race.
I mean, why do you think that is? Because I actually remember learning about male privilege before I learned about white privilege in my university, you know, foray in the now 20 years ago. But like, I also noticed that as soon as we started talking about racial privilege, the male privilege discourse kind of faded out. And it was, I remember that more as a 90s like third wave feminist discourse than I do whatever, you know, the quote intersectional. It's funny when we literally teach these now as if, you know, because I used to teach social studies, and as early as 2017 we were talking about like the waves of feminism and how we're now at the final good wave, the intersectional wave, where all the contradictions of waves 1 through 3
we're gonna work it out, don't worry guys.
Right. And this was in like a conservative state textbook, so you know it's an interesting thing to look at. So is it just because of the debates around the art teens? One of the interesting weird things I remember from 2 years ago, so this is more recent, but watching Starmer's First Labor campaign use American privilege language and American DEI language as it was already becoming unpopular here, but using it in Britain, but not even using it in a specifically British context. It seemed like it was aimed at an American audience. And I was like, why the fuck would you do that? Like, that doesn't make any, like, we're not your electorate at all. Like, what's going on here?
We need to help out African-American British people.
It's just, I was like, I mean, yes, there's racially targeted policing in the UK, but like pretending that it's the same as the US is kind of nuts. So like, both in who it's targeting and then the extent, like how many people have been killed by British police versus how many people have been killed by American police, and you're looking at an order of magnitude difference, or maybe two.
Right. So, it's interesting because especially there's the whole like a statistical issue, like in Britain in terms of police deaths, because we have so few, we count every single person that's come into contact with the police and then died within like the next 24 hours. So if you die in like cell, if you die in a jail cell from suicide, that counts. While in the US, the figure is much more like a policeman shot him and then he died. They're often like, especially in mainstream media, they struggle even to make the connection there. Where it's like, okay, like the policeman shot him and he died, but like, can we really blame the bullets?
Yeah, it's it's kind of crazy. Also, you keep the statistics on it for you do sociological research, so you know on most things the American government keeps great statistics, not on cop deaths. Like it is really hard to actually figure out. Usually it's like journalists tracking things, and sometimes they're wrong and they don't have the same criterion on how they're tracking it. And also who counts. I remember there was this bizarre trend in the teens when we around about 10 years ago. We had a series of mixed race shooters, and like they were recording them as white.
I thought you were going to say they recorded them twice.
No, they recorded them as white. But there is another one, like when you hear stuff about mass shootings in the U.S. and you hear the racial demographics, there's one definition, and then you hear the large number and they use a different definition. So the racial demographics being predominantly white, that's actually, and that's actually changing too. Yeah. But historically, that's for random, unmotivated shootings. But when you hear the large number of mass shootings, which is any shooting where 3 or more people shot.
Yeah, because that's almost always gangland shootings, right?
It's gangland shooting. So the racial statistics look more like the racial statistics you'd expect, given over policing, et cetera, et cetera. But those two things are cited by journalists side by side, without the caveat that they're actually measuring different things. And that was very common to do in the aught teens. Like I just remember like going through common reporting and common statements and noticing stuff like that all the time. And it would also would be talking about how privilege kills, and it led to a particularly absurd statement, not on the Floyd BLM uprising, but on the first ones, the ones that happened out of the first round in 2013, 2014. I remember Toni Morrison saying that when white people have to mourn a white teen being innocently shot, and I was like, do you not know racial statistics? Because in the United States, actually the biggest predictor you're going to be shot by police is actually do you have a history of mental illness, then what's your race. And that's proportional, but in absolute numbers, there's still a ton of unarmed white men shot.
Right, but it is true in a sense, right? Because these white young men aren't positioned as white young men; they're just positioned as young men, and so there isn't kind of like a white collective mourning of them. So in one sense, he's right, but not because these young men aren't being killed, but just because they're not being understood in this sense.
They're not racial. They are not presented racially. And I actually do think there's, because of the proportionality, I think there's some legitimacy to talking about that, but it leads to these absurd statements in the way people would phrase it that were also just any chud, to be quite frank, could figure out that the statement wasn't true.
Yeah.
Which could also and is often used by right wingers in the United States to just be like, well, all this discourse is bollocks, and also we don't need to do anything about race at all. We've already figured all that. Look, we have Barack Obama as president, and Condoleezza Rice was a thing, and so it was, so you can see this discourse, and yet there's also a discourse that will say that there's absolutely no difference between now and the pre-civil rights movement, and I find that absurd. And one of the things that I find absurd by it was like, there's been so much change that there's shock over things that were common even when I was a kid. I come from an area of the country that used to have sundown towns in the 80s, which, if for listeners who don't know, in the UK, or if you're stupid in America, sundown towns were places where black people couldn't be after dark because they would likely get lynched. And there were still some of these places, even in the Northeast, as late as the late 80s, early 90s. They were rare then, but they existed. And I don't know how many people that I heard learned about that from fucking Lovecraft Country, even in the black community. It was kind of shocking. Like, or if you remember it, everybody learning about Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, and I was like, well,
that was from a TV show, right?
Yeah, it was a TV show, and then all of a sudden in the activist discourse, no one would shut up about it, and I was just like, I'm like, yeah, I knew about that, I
read it 10 years earlier in Wikipedia.
Right, like, but like it had never, like, it never come up really, like. Even in my civil rights courses, it was mentioned once, and just kind of skipped over. And then it was an obsession for a little while. I find these things fascinatingly problematic.
Yeah, I think you bring up something with this like idea, trying to argue as if racism is exactly as bad as it was in 1960 or 1860, which I found very interesting, because in the low privilege sample of these popular texts, they would make constant references to slavery, to Jim Crow. And then one of the books in my sample was the book New Jim Crow, which positions the American prison system as like the third great turning of American racism. The American prison system positioned as basically the tool by which the United States materially exploits Black people. And so in these low privilege texts, you have this complete historicization of constantly referencing back and trying to make comparable what's currently going on to what's going on in the past. And obviously there's a lot of tension in there, because when you're doing a social problem thesis, you don't want to be arguing like things were really, really bad then, and now they're kind of like really bad, but not as bad as then. Like you always want to position it as like a growing problem. And so ones that came out a bit later would reference Trump as kind of like a revival of racialism or whatever. But then in the privileged texts, I really expected them to go on about slavery, because the low privileged texts went on and on and on about slavery and on about Jim Crow. And the ones that were published after New Jim Crow talked about New Jim Crow. But they just didn't. They didn't historicize it at all. They were just these complete, like floating in a void of like the contemporary moment. Like D'Angelo has this narrative where she's visiting workplaces and trying to educate people about white fragility and privilege and so on. She doesn't talk about slavery. She doesn't talk about segregation. She doesn't talk about any of this. These texts are not historicized at all. They're completely alienated from. But yeah, privilege is just completely alienated from any kind of historicism. It's just this, and they never talk about like, you know, there'll often be a story in these books about an origin of racism, which is a very useful thing you want to position your social problem in social problems discourse as something which is a really bad problem, is growing, but it's also contingent and solvable. Because if it isn't contingent and solvable, then people will just shrug their shoulders and be like, well, if we can't solve it, then I don't care. Or maybe I care, but like, what can you do? But in privileged discourse, it's positioned as not contingent. It just always was, it always will be. I think that's a really fascinating thing about it, and why I talk about, and it's plausibly the reason why I take privilege to be like a moderately successful discourse. Okay, there are like some dramas about privilege. There's plenty of privilege talk going on, but it's not something like critical race theory, which they try to ban in Florida. Like, I think that's kind of the mark of like a very like popular woke discourse, is when they try and ban it in Florida.
And so, you know, you contend that the privilege here is not a threat because it is both easily understandable and everyone hates it because they kind of understand that it's free floating, and also it can be used to make everyone's life worse. So it's, I mean, that was the thing that I was, when we talk about Toni Morrison, that I thought was actually the other bizarre implication of that, beside all the statistical stuff that we talked about, is that she wasn't positing a world where where nobody got shot by the cops for no reason. She was positing a world where people equally got shot by the cops for no reason. And I was like, okay. Like,
yeah, no, it's kind of crazy.
How is that a liberatory discourse again? Like, you know, we could actually meet the, and you heard, at first I thought it was just implicit in the rhetoric that
yeah, you're like, okay, like that's kind of the unfortunate implication, right? But you don't actually think that,
right?
But then they're like, oh no, we actually think that.
When I saw people celebrating the deaths of despair and the decline in life expectancy of specifically white working class people in the United States, it was celebrated in some discourses, not in many. I don't want to say that like liberals were all celebrating it, but the first thing I heard is opioid deaths are just about white people, and I was like, what? Okay. And second was that, oh, this is just what happens when you remove privilege, and I was like, so we are approaching equality.
So we should keep it then?
Yeah. So we're approaching equality by making but not lifting everybody up to the same level, but basically saying, well, the world would be fine if, just people got shot in the right proportions amongst poor people. And you go, well, no one actually thinks that. And I'm like, no, there's some people who do. Like, they really do. That's the other thing about privileged discourse, unlike one of the things I find fascinating about it is once you dehistoricize it, and you talked about low privilege texts, and I guess you're talking about high privilege texts. And by that you mean who's the audience aimed at? Like, low privilege text is aimed at.
Sorry. I meant when it's talking about low privilege texts, I meant texts which don't use privilege or use it only a few times.
Okay, yeah.
They were historicized, while high privilege texts, as in high usage of privilege, they weren't historicized.
Okay. Well, what I also find interesting about that is the audience for those are different. Like, yes, they're all kind of for white audience, but like the new Jim Crow is not for people to go and get HR trainings. It was an academic text. Like, I mean, it was a popular one. It was a popularization of other academic work. Let me rephrase that. But it was, it was aimed at the New Yorker crowd. Whereas D'Angelo and co were aimed at the New Yorker crowd, but also like activists and people doing HR trainings and the DSA. Like they had a much broader audience, and I also found it fascinating by the end of the audience.
And it worked, right? They pulled out.
Well, it worked. It was, what I find interesting is it both worked, but also in some ways collapsed very quickly. Like that whole, there's a whole cottage industry that blew up and now has retreated pretty much only into academia. Like there are still academics who talk and think this way, but even in like teacher trainings and stuff, and I don't just mean in red states, this kind of discourse is becoming a lot less salient. Yeah, we still talk about it. We still talk about implicit and explicit bias and stuff like that too, but it's already losing steam as a discourse, even amongst social justice oriented progressives.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is that you mentioned kind of selling books to white people, and I think that's a reason why there is this kind of fascinating reversal, which has happened, where basically all discourse up to now when talking about inequality talked about those on the bottom. Privilege comes along and talks about people on the top. And if you want to sell books to people on the top, who are the people who buy books, then that's a really useful discourse to have. People like to read books which talk about them. When you're trying to have this kind of self-help book, you want it to be addressed in the second person, in the form of you. And if you're talking about discrimination in those terms, you have this awkward thing where you're always going, you aren't, discriminated against. You aren't. You're always like switching from you, but you don't have. Well, if you talk about privilege, you can just be like, you have this, you're like this, you have these characteristics, and so on and so on.
So this is an easier sell to the audience because it can both play into that want to be just.
Like it'll have the same form as non-political self-help. Because non-political self-help won't be talking about this other group who isn't you, which has some advantage over you, or blah, blah, blah. They'll be talking about you and your like bad traits and your possibly positive traits and so on. By using privilege discourse, you can talk in the exact same way using the exact same language.
So you have argued, and I don't think you're the first person to argue this. I actually think Walter Ben Michaels kind of argued the same thing like a decade ago. But that privilege also had the advantage of being particularly useful as a way of justifying austerity. Because this whole implication that we're talking about, where you can say, well, we can fix the privilege problem by just structurally removing it for everybody. And we don't have to fix anything. We just have to make sure that the injustice is fair. The reason why I think that that's more pernicious and maybe intentional later on than people give it credit for is that it is also tied into arguments about austerity, particularly, for example, the Abraham X. Kendi argument and I think Abraham X. Kendi is actually one of the more reasonable of these figures too. So this is where we're gonna get, but where like if I do something economically that would help disproportionately Black people, or descendants of slaves or whatever, but I do not do it for racial reasons, according to X. Kendi, that's racist. So we shouldn't do it. Whereas,
which is a really great way to make sure, if you've got the same policy and you're trying to appeal to the American public, going on and on and on about how it will help specifically Black people and not other people is a great way to make it less popular.
Right. I mean, Adolf Reed talks about this. Like in some ways, if you actually care about Black people, one of the things you don't want to do is make all the social reforms that would help Black people just racial, particularly in a period of austerity. Because another thing we know from sociology is racial groups see each other in competition when times are lean more than in other times. So like,
right. I mean, it's a classic thing where, what do you call them? We call them benefits in the UK.
Right.
Like
we call them entitlements here.
Entitlements, which sounds even worse, right? Where basically people will be like, we need to get rid of benefits, by which they mean like the money, the billions and quadrillions of money that the government gives people I don't like, which are often some racialized group. Especially in the UK, it's focused less on racialized groups, specifically on the status of immigrants.
Yeah, and so this seems like a good way to just make sure that you can't do much and that you could achieve it by.
I mean, the other thing about austerity, to link the two kind of neoliberalisms, is you have the neoliberalism of downgrading, of being of degrowth, of saying we have to accept. We once thought in modernity that human beings have the power to change the world to our will, and that we control technology, and that we can use technology and advances in other ways to control the world and to make it how we wish it, to control human society and make it how we wish it. Neoliberalism, postmodern neoliberalism, is saying all of that is not true. We can't control the world. We can't control these grand things. There's these things like climate change, which are just these total externalities, which we can't stop. And all we can do is adapt to them and change them. And to link the personalism of privilege to this idea of downgrading, it's really cheap, instead of trying to solve a social problem by hiring a lot of people and spending a lot of money and giving people a lot of money. It's really cheap to instead to tell people, change what's going inside your head. Focus on the internals of you and try and change yourself and alter yourself. That's really, really cheap. Obviously, it ends up not being, because then you have to hire a whole class of PMC bureaucrats to do this mind changing. But it can be very appealing to public officials in states, in places, which will continually have this constant budget pressure. These kind of programs, which allege these very useful effects, but don't require significant funding, are going to be very, very appealing. Stuff like wellness is very, very appealing. And in the same way, this self-help style privilege discourse will be appealing.
Again, to focus on other pernicious effects, if you focus on, say, fairness within the system, and you were to achieve parity in academia, for example, like the academic numbers somehow end up reflecting racial numbers, which in the United States has been attempted, but it's been attempted disproportionately through accepting rich immigrants to meet a lot of the unofficial quotas to increase the diversity ratios of the school. That's not all of it, but like that's been what's driving, the African descendants of slave only movement, because
I mean, there's this fascinating thing, right, in California where I don't know if it passed, but there was a measure in California to get rid of the amendment to the state constitution, which said that you can't discriminate based on race or whatever. They wanted to get rid of that so they could do positive discrimination, but it seems so glaringly obvious that allows so many disasters in the future.
Oh yeah. Well, this also came from D'Angelo and Ex-Kindi, that we needed to allow for discrimination so we could do positive discrimination. One school district even tried to have racially preferenced firing. It, of course, got thrown out of court. It hasn't gone to the Supreme Court, but on this one, I will just say the law is actually very clear. You can't do that. And if you do it, you're misrecognizing power. Like I sort of like, it's this weird thing where I'm like, do you think that only white liberals have power and that they'll actually follow through with this consistently? Like that this will only be in your favor? I mean, and in the US, this discourse, I think one of the most fascinating things that I've seen happen is this discourse has been turned against in communities of color as well. Like this is no longer a very popular discourse amongst non-elite Black people. And in fact, I've listened to NPR talk about how to get the Black male community on board with this again, because there's study after study. It says that Black men in particular feel like this is a distorting discourse. But also that, this leads to interesting other problems, like the increased talk after the Floyd uprisings or whatever. I never know what to call them. They seem like more than protests, but less than insurrection. So it's like,
I say George Floyd uprising in my PhD, which I think is a fun phrase to include in your PhD.
Yeah. But there was this focus on anti-Blackness, not about this privilege discourse, but it wasn't aimed at white people. It was aimed at internal ethnic tensions within people calling the United States, which are very real.
Light skin privilege.
Light skin privilege, the move from POC to BIPOC so that you can separate Black and Indigenous as special categories but still keep it together. And I will admit that change happened. That's probably the fastest racial language change I've ever seen. Was the shift from African Americans back to Black people to people of color to BIPOC. It happened in a decade.
BIPOC is a great phrase because it's constantly misunderstood as bisexual people of color.
That's funny. And yeah, you're probably right. It would be misunderstood quite a bit. So, at risk of two white guys talking about privilege discourse, I think it is important to just admit that this discourse is so simple, it's so understandable, and yet also I want to talk to you a little bit about other things that mystifies. We talked about the downward nature and the austerity nature of the way it can be used, because you can fix it in any number of ways, and the easy way to fix it is check on yourself, go self-help, and also maybe we'll do some systemic stuff to fire more white people, which, isn't going to lead to racial backlash at all. Like, it's just like, it's not going to self-perpetuate the problem that we are also ostensibly saying that we want to solve. The other thing that was shocking, it's implied in the last little bit of discourse that we had about like people, this working for people, is the amount of money that was raked in and lost in these various DEI initiatives based off privilege theory has been kind of astounding. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? Like, what was going on there?
What do you mean exactly? What are you thinking of here?
I'm thinking like the Ex-Kindi Foundation. Like, you have millions of dollars going into a lab that essentially achieved or did nothing, like, and has now ruined Abraham Ex-Kindi's reputation. Or even as early as 2014, you remember I don't know if you're old enough, but Do you remember the cancel culture stuff initially about cancel Colbert? Why we moved from call out culture to cancel culture as the way we talked about this, right?
Yeah, I remember. I mean, it was before Me Too, right?
Yeah, it was right before Me Too. It's like the first wave of this. It was the cancel Colbert because there was a racist joke making fun of a racist thing. And an Asian American woman, talked about the racism of it and tried to get Colbert canceled, and that's where canceling came from. It didn't work. And what it came out that this woman, Sui Park, who eventually gives up on social justice, becomes a church lady. Her story is fascinating and bizarre. But what she was doing is she, at a couple of tweets about this, she was bragging about how she gave up $1,000 speaking fees in 2014 to, harass Colbert on Twitter, because she was pulling in, $5,000 to $8,000 a week doing anti-discrimination training, and this was like right before even first BLM. So that's when I became aware that this discourse from McClintock that's originally used on teachers have been picked up by HR, initially in a purely negative way, as just a way to prevent being sued by doing requisite training and saying you've done due diligence like that. So wanted to talk about, like, that seems to be one of the ways that this became an off ramp. I mean, there's two. I think blogs and the aughts plays a big role, and then I think and cultural criticism, because oh my God, the privileged discourse around cultural criticism for the last 15, 20 years has been intense. But also the fact that the nature of later civil rights law, particularly after the initial ones in the 1960s, instead of being positive, they became protective, which means that it enabled you as grounds of lawsuits. So HR departments started really getting interested in showing that they'd done due diligence on this to avoid lawsuits. And it seems like that intersection of lawsuit and academia doesn't happen a lot, but it really happened here on the privileged discourse. So what did your research tell you about how that affected and changed and mutated all this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to return to the idea of kind of privilege as a kind of moderately successful discourse, that, it did have this saying, D'Angelo did get rich on it, but then, she's kind of disappeared since then. I think a big struggle that privilege, as much as it's kind of generally appealing to within a lot of kind of woke circles, is there's a really big problem with it, is that explicitly from Macintosh is saying white woman academics need to focus more on white woman academics. And D'Angelo is basically saying a very similar thing, like, no, actually, white people need to think about white people, need to talk about white people. And I think that is the main way that kind of privileged discourse bumps up against like the rest of woke discourse, where all the rest of woke discourse is all about centering voices or whatever. It's all about hearing from the discriminated against. But that really conflicts with what's going on in white privilege, where it's like, no, you as a white author need to talk about white people and white concerns and focus on white concerns, which is the crazy thing in why, like in Finkelstein works, he basically says, D'Angelo is like a pseudo white supremacist or whatever. Like, that's kind of the road that she's leading down. So I think that's if you're talking about kind of how privilege flared up, but now is kind of more struggling. I think this significant conflict with the rest of woke discourse is a major problem for it.
Do you see this privileged discourse staying? Of the ways that we've talked about race and gender since I've been alive, so the 80s, but really, as far as like me being aware of political discourse, is the 90s. This one seems to be the one that has not gone away. Like, everything else has gone through cycles and waves and kind of faded pretty quickly. I mean, we're already seeing the collapse of CRT. I mean, yeah, CRT has origins in the 80s, but also like privileged discourse didn't catch on until the last 20 years. So its first 20 years it was basically a legal theory. Where do you see it going now? Because on one hand, it seems to come straight up against all the other problems of woke discourse, anti-racist discourse, general leftist discourse. There has been for America for the first time in a long time actual talks about class for also the same time period, interestingly. And you've had the construction of like two opposing lefts, one which is really focused on privilege and race, and one which is focused on class. And one of those has more centrist backers than the other, obviously. But it does seem like this discourse seems not exhausted both within progressive circles and in general culture. But I still see it as being so simple and so easy to apply, and also so mystifying. And one of the things that your research talks about is like, you do have to ask who puts the money in the pockets of white people then, and no one ever seems to do that. So, and how is this working exactly? And I remember hearing stuff about like, racial privilege around Harvard and Yale, and me going like, well, it's ironic that these white institutions, but then I looked at their board and I'm like, no, the boards are more diverse than the general population, actually.
Yeah.
Like, so I can't even say that anymore. So do you see this as having staying power? Is it coming up on the shores, or is it weirdly going to do that thing that American ideas often do, that European idea? There's often a way in which a European idea will die in Europe and be reborn here, and then we'll change it and give it back to you, and then it'll die in Europe again. It seems like privileged discourse is one of these that's actually, in the long durée, yes, it comes from Europe because we got to go all the way back to the French Revolution. But in the intermediate durée, it actually comes from America. But it seems like now that it probably has more penchant, at least in the English-speaking world, outside of the United States rather than in it. Maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but it does seem like it's more exhausted here than over there. I just don't know if it's going to go away or not. I mean, what do you see happening in the future with this discourse pattern?
I think privilege certainly will at least have like a moderate role going forward. I don't think it'll die. And I think that comes from the fact that it's the only inversionist discourse out there. And probably as things develop, we might get more inversionist discourses. By inversionist discourses, I mean, when you're talking about racism, instead of talking about black people, you talk about white people. And, there's whiteness studies and so on, but I think privilege is the main way you'd go about that. And it's a universal one. So it's the one where if you want to talk about men, when talking about sexism, you use privilege. And if you want to talk about straight people, when you're talking about queer issues, you use privilege. And there aren't really any competitors. Like all the other ones that we talk about, they're focused on discrimination. They talk about, when talking about racism, they talk about black people. They want to focus in this way, and they're all directly competing with each other in this way. While privilege is basically alone without any direct competitors in terms of being an inversionist discourse, a discourse which talks about the other side, about the alleged beneficiaries of these systems. And so on that basis, I think it'll go up and it'll go down. But until there are more inversionist discourses in whatever form that might be, that probably already exists but aren't prominent, I think privilege will stick around because it's the only one that is doing this particular thing, which other discourses aren't fulfilling. And when I highlight the conflicts that privilege has with these other parts of woke discourse, and the fact that it's not centering black voices or whatever, that is also a positive for privilege, because it means if you want to do something in if you don't want to center black voices, you want to center white voices, but you want to do it in a legitimate way, white privilege is the way forward. So
ironically, it actually assuages a sense of the privileged people, of the privileged, and I'm putting that in air quotes for people who are watching, groups' own narcissism. Right?
I think people are not just as willing, but if you're ranking discourses, people are much more interested in hearing negative things about themselves than they are about hearing positive things about other people or whatever. People are very focused on themselves, And so if there's a discourse which facilitates that, then it's definitely going to stick around in one form or another.
Yeah, and I guess in a way, this is stuck around now for.
I mean, the big critiques
50 years.
The big critiques of it I highlight are 20 years old now. So,
right. Well, I was just about to say, like the critiques that we've talked about today. A lot of this was even noted before this discourse pattern became as widespread as it was. Like, and then there's popular books. Walter B. Michaels, Adolf Rita, both been talking about this for years. And then you can see where this privilege theory can get in even weirder ways. I know that I have a certain portion of my audience that's Afro-pessimist and pathetic, but I've always been like, well, it doesn't. Eternal victim discourses, I have learned the distrust because, frankly, I'm partially Jewish, and so like, the first time I ever heard an argument about how we were uniquely oppressed and this was never going to change was from Jews, and that's why we needed our own state.
Yeah, I was going to say it just leads to Black Zionism, and not in the conspiracy theory, just actual Black Zionism.
Right. So it would be a way to, like, you know, create a discourse around this, but it is interesting how this worked better. And I did notice that you're right in timing this re-exploding again after the Floyd uprising, because even in both BLM, we had a pattern where it moved from industrial Midwestern, mostly black city streets into and the first round it moved into the university, and the second round it moved into elite cities on both coasts. Which I don't even think, I actually don't even think that was all illegitimate, because I don't think everything going on in the Floyd uprising was all just cynical ID politics either. But we've seen this discourse wash out in two ways. So the first time it created like this focus on Black empowerment and like getting more, like I once was at a charter school that had a BLM activist talk to it, and literally they were talking about diversifying the FBI to a group of students, half of whom were African, and like didn't understand.
We need to make it as diverse as the CIA,
right? And the other thing was that they were like, well, white people have ethnicities and black people don't, and then there's Africans in the audience, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Like,
we have an ethnicity each.
Yeah, we have like I have like 3 different ethnicities actually. So like, what do you want?
Yeah, I mean, I think that'll be an interesting thing going forward, as obviously the population of Africa explodes, and then necessarily like the population of Africans, as Africans massively increases in like the Anglophone world, and how kind of African American and British Black discourse, which are predominantly, well, in Britain it's mixed, but certainly in the US you have people, you know, the main group African Americans have been separated from African culture for generations, and through the process of slavery, like any connection to it was basically completely annihilated. How the racial discourse in the United States, the United Kingdom, and so on will evolve as more and more Black people in both these countries are of immediate African descent.
Well, I mean, we're seeing this in the United States in the ADOS split, because the one thing that we can say in the U.S. is Black immigrants tend to come from 2 groups. They either come from refugees, like from Somalia, Eritrea, etc., or they are the absolute richest people in Nigeria and Senegal, etc. Like, and so that's already led to, and also not, you know, relatively well people from the Caribbean, Kamala Harris's family, for example. This has led to what might be considered inter-Black new ethnic tensions, where there's a tension between African Americans and relative elites on one end, and then also poor Africans on the other, who they also kind of see as other and different, but poorer, and a drain on their resources. And I don't want, when I say this, I don't want to say that like even most Black people say this, but these are discourses that are emerging right now and are beginning to have more and more power.
Yeah, and as more people come and things get worse, of course these things will prosper.
Yeah. I mean, we also see this in tensions where there's a lot of Black community fear of Latin immigrants as a competitor group for what they see as declining resources that should be theirs from inner cities. And so like this racialization mixed with this discourse pattern, when you introduce new groups, actually destabilizes it in ways that goes in ways that I think well-meaning educated liberals, regardless of their race, often do not see and do not think about. Like, it's not something that they really spend a lot of time thinking about because it's not about them at all. And God forbid something not about the white people, including their evilness and guilt. So it's you know, and
kind of Americans can't even really get on the thing of like, you know, they can't talk about how they colonized Africa because they didn't.
Right. No, I've actually pointed out that like when people like talk about like the U.S. and African extraction, I'm like, we do some of it, but you'd actually be surprised. We have mostly just not given a shit about Africa. Like, it's not been, you know, the only thing that we've really focused on is AFRICOM as a military projection. But I was actually surprised myself when I was like, no, a lot of those resources are going to Europe. So like, you know, this isn't even totally us. And, you know, people will say, well, Europe, I've even heard this. I've even heard some people of color say this in the United States, but like Europe is just a U.S. proxy state anyway. I'm like, no, it's not. Like,
or at least 50 U.S. proxy states.
Yeah, and they don't get along. Like, you know,
no, like Europe, very much we have our own issues and our own imperialisms and so on. Even if we are in the end sub-imperial to the United States, that doesn't mean that France isn't doing something new nuclear in particular in Africa. I mean, Obviously, the only way you can talk about kind of American colonialism of Africa is to start talking about Liberia, and you definitely don't want to start talking about Liberia if you want any kind of neat racial discourse.
Yes, because that's a history that I actually know, and it's one that Americans avoid like the plague. Because I'm like, oh, so we tried to set up a Black return state, but it was not in the place where most of the original slaves were taken from. And so, it immediately caused ethnic tensions and civil wars. And we just kind of don't own that. Like, I was just like, because it's not neat. It's not a neat story to tell. Like,
on the slightest.
So it's and one that I think only became relatively nonviolent in the last 15 years. I during the aughts, I remember there was ethnic tensions and civil wars.
I mean, yeah, they had a brutal long civil war.
Right. So yeah, Americans don't like to talk about that. I suppose one thing that I can ask you is, do you think this will continue having purchase in Europe? Because I don't understand. I actually don't really understand why it got so much purchase in Europe. I'm just like, yeah, you have racial problems, but they're not. And for those of you, no, Europe is not some post-racial utopia. But how in the hell did our discourse patterns become popular in Britain and France? It doesn't actually make that much sense to me, because you don't even define, like, even between, we speak the same language, but who we call Black is very different, and not just on the mixed question either. I mean, also associations with Asian are entirely different, and indigeneity is not a racial thing in Britain. So like it's
right. Yeah. I'm the indigenous person, which is discourse you only get into in the United Kingdom if you're incredibly right wing,
right,
like full on neo-Nazi is the only way you get into indigeneity discourse in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, you're Celto Anglo-Saxons. So.
I mean, it is funny. I was getting denounced in the YouTube comment sections as like colonizer. I'm like, I've never colonized anything. Not even my ancestors. I've just, we've just farmed dirt for 6,000 years.
Well, I mean, this is the. I mean, one. I have sort of been like, okay, yes, we are descendants of colonizers, but active colonization has been kind of a completed project for 150 years, with the exception of Hawaii and maybe Alaska. And I don't know how, like, when I talk about this, I'm like, so what do you want? I mean, I recently went to Ed Talk and they had our land acknowledgement, and then someone tried to like include white people. Like everyone's indigenous to somewhere, and I was like, I'm not. Like,
where the fuck are you? Yeah, like
half my ancestors are from North Africa, and the other half are from your cold Corset Isle. You're like in the north, so like what? You're like, which one do I pick? Like the one with the better food? What relationship do I have with either, the land of the Highlands and the Hebrides, or like Morocco and Bulgaria? Like it's just, the answer is like fucking none. I have no relationship to that land.
It means nothing to you.
And even being obsessed with your ancestry's ethnic heritage seems to be a weirdly American obsession. Like it's.
Again in Europe, like doing that is for bizarre right-wing people,
right? Whereas in the post-settler diaspora, whatever, we're totally fucking obsessed with like where we came from and like which weird little island, and like people like, I'm Irish. I'm like, your family hasn't fucking lived in the Isles for like 400 fucking years. Like,
yeah, I mean that brings us to what is the important distinction in Europe, which is between people who are immigrants and people who aren't immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
That's the important distinction. And obviously, being an immigrant in Europe doesn't mean someone who's an immigrant in the literal sense. Like German people in France aren't immigrants, and French people in Germany aren't immigrants, and British people in Spain aren't immigrants, and Australians in the United Kingdom aren't immigrants, and
are Americans in the United Kingdom immigrants? That's the question. Okay, yeah, that's why I didn't think so. I always thought.
I guess it would be. Yeah, no, like they're part of kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but the proper sort of people, and even it extends like relatively like, and something which kind of American racial discourse wouldn't be able to cope with is the fact that until recently, at least, British perception of Indian immigration was positive, right. As in Indian people are like at least 40% British. They're part of our communal history, and so when they come here, it's fine. But Bulgarians and Romanians were widely, incredibly hated.
Yeah, I was explaining like that Commonwealth people were less problematic than Slavs, and like in America, everyone was like, "What?" I mean, there are bizarro sub communities like if you're specifically in Oregon, there's been anti-Slavic tension. So like sometimes you'll hear people talk in Oregon about Slavs being people of color, which I'm also like. Like just like
Albanians can say the N-word in New York.
Yeah, and it's just like, okay, so I have another out, I guess, if I want to. But like as one of these very, very pale people who can occasionally go, I'm off white. I didn't do it. But in a real sense, this racial discourse is flattening. The settler discourse is flattening. I have always been like, so do you guys literally want to get rid of like at the most generous interpretation, 80% of the population because it would still apply to Asians and Latins.
Yeah, I mean, the whole land back thing and whatever, it's like beyond the fact that you're, I don't know, deporting Europeans or making them all live in like high rises on 1% of the land. What on earth are you doing with the black people? Do they just get to be kumbaya with the indigenous people? Because if so, they're going to be like 95% of the population.
Yeah, it doesn't. I don't think people think it through.
I mean, they don't, because if you do, then you get really bad results.
I mean, my critique of land back is a little different than yours. Mine is that I don't know what people mean by it, because some of them mean exactly what you're saying, and some of them mean like this other thing that is like,
right,
okay,
I mean, it's. I don't know if you ever saw when me and Ben talking about prison abolition,
right?
But it's this thing where either you mean what it literally means, you're going to get rid of prisons in bourgeois society, which is a terrible fucking idea, or you don't mean what you're saying, and you actually mean like prison reform, in which case you're packaging a popular idea in the most unpopular jacket you can find. And the same thing goes for land back, whether either you mean like deporting white people or making them live in like high rises and on no percent of the land, or you mean like respecting treaties with indigenous people, in which case you're jacketing this popular idea in a very unpopular idea.
Yeah, prison abolition is one of those things where you and I probably slightly disagree about it, but I'm also like, you can't do it in bourgeois society unless you just want to hang a bunch of people. Like there's I
mean, that's what anarchists will say, right? They'll be like, yeah, we'll just kill people, which I respect more than like the liberal kind of prison abolitionist people who are like, but it's also nuts.
Well, police abolition is similar, where I'm like, okay, you're going to abolish the police before you deal with the social problems, and you'll hear arguments for it, but I'm like, yeah, we could do that if we had equalized wealth and a universal conscription into peace forces, but I doubt you want universal conscription in the peace forces, for one, even though it would be fair and just, and two, under current conditions, all that would lead to is private policing by corporations, and so and you would have a disadvantage because they have money and thus weapons. If they want to, they can buy them. You can't. So I don't really understand what you're doing, but I think you and I kind of. One thing I've learned from the Palestine stuff in the United States is when you make a demand that's possible, that's when they crush you.
Yeah.
Like,
but I mean, if we're listening to Chairman Mao, that indicates you're on the right lines, right?
Right.
Like we've made a clear line between when we were attacked by our enemies. That shows we're doing the right thing.
Whereas, like,
while if you go to a big corporation, you're like, oh, can I teach you about privilege? And they say yes. That's when you know you fucked up.
Yeah, something's wrong. And that, I think that has to be dealt with. And one of the things that I worry about is I think it will be dealt with. I just don't know that any of us are going to like how it's dealt with. Like if we don't come up with answers for this, somebody else will.
Yeah, I mean, that's my other big line I go on about. Things can always get worse. Lots of people talk as if like any other solution to the present state of things in regards to prisons or whatever else has to be better. And it's like, no, it doesn't. Things can get so much worse. Like if you're not currently hearing artillery fire, things can get worse.
And even if you are, frankly.
And even if you are, things can get a lot worse. I've heard plenty of artillery fire in situations where I was basically fine, and the people around me were fine, and the civilians around us were basically fine.
Yeah, I mean, like I've been basically fine around bombs, so it's one of those things. It's just like, I mean, I wouldn't suggest it. It's not good for your mental health, but like, I also think. Yeah, it could always get way worse. Even wars. When I tell people like about war, I'm like, wars of attrition are way nastier than other kinds of wars, and I think people are being reminded of that right now because we're seeing two of them at once.
Yeah.
I mean, really, we shouldn't call one of them a war of attrition. We should kind of just call it what it is, which is a massacre. But
a punishing of the helots is surprisingly apt.
Well, yeah, somebody recently, I think it was Ben Shapiro, somebody like that, who was comparing Israel to Sparta as a good thing, and I'm like, I don't think you realize how apt that is. And
it's interesting because when you hear about stuff like the punishing of the helots, or like what's it called, like the separation of the plebs in Rome, you're hearing about events which you presume are kind of pseudo mythical. That probably something relatively similar happened, but it's not the case that they did it in this kind of formal way. It wasn't the case that all the plebs in Rome went and sat on a hill for 3 weeks. It's not the case that Sparta had this ritual punishment of the helots every how many years. But then you see what's going on in Israel, and you're like, oh, maybe the helot thing was real, because they're doing it in such a literal and straightforward manner.
Yeah, it's something else to see. So, I don't know, maybe people will have more things to worry about than their privilege. I think that's the other thing about right now. It's like, well, you have even as white people, you have more real problems. So, like, maybe you should be thinking about that. But nonetheless, Stefan, where can people find your work?
You can find my work. I do a podcast every Sunday on This is Revolution, Give Them an Argument, with Ben Burgess doing popular philosophy. I'm kind of in a transition. I'm thinking of reopening my Tumblr and putting all my essays on there.
All right.
But I mean, you can find my recently archived articles on sublation, but I haven't published there in a while.
All right. And I guess you are technically, because of that thing on philosophy, you were part of the TIR crew, but also given the difference in land mass, you often can't be on the live stream. So
yeah, the only one that I'm awake for is the Sunday one, the Saturday one.
Yeah. So there's that. All right. Well, people should look up your work, and if this ever becomes available as a book, as dissertations often are, and when you get out and have to unmonograph it, and
I'm going to try and make it into a compact article. That seems like the kind of thing they would like.
Yeah, they would. So people should be looking for it. All right. Thank you so much.